Thank you very much. It's great to be here. During the years when I worked intensely with Lowy, particularly Michael Falilov and Alan Ginchel, this place was being retrofitted, and I'm so glad to see what a beautiful job has been done. No postmodern touches, just the beautiful building as it was. So warm congratulations to the Lowy Institute. Why am I speaking on this topic today? Well, I left India earlier than I would have liked to. When I went to India in 2006, I had hoped to be there for 4 years or so. But the job I'm currently doing was advertised in The Economist only 18 months later. And much as I adored India, I knew it wouldn't become available again in my career span. So I competed for it, and then when unexpectedly I was offered it, I had to make a very, very difficult decision. But my consolation prize to myself on leaving India was to deepen a project of writing on Indian foreign policy and expand it into perhaps a more ambitious book than I otherwise would have. And that adventure, sadly, is coming to a close for me. I've been working on it very actively 3 years. Now it'll go into the editing project, the editing phase. Coming to my topic, India and China, we tend to think of them as emerging the way we think of Brazil as emerging, and sometimes South Africa. But this is profoundly unhelpful. What India and China are doing is re-emerging. When one looks at economic history, one sees that up until about 1750, both countries had been major contributors to global economic output. It was only in the 2 subsequent centuries that as Europe's growth accelerated, and not coincidentally, the colonial experiences of both India and China intensified, India and China's relative contribution to world growth collapsed. Historically, at any given time, although India and China had moving borders throughout history, the norm seems to have been for China to contribute about 25% of global output and India about 20% of global output. Now that China is on a fast track to reverting to that norm, and India is trying its best to, will re-experience what the historic norm was. But it's a great surprise in the West. It's a tremendous surprise in the West to find that, especially for secondary countries, that we may be, to a large degree, marginalized by the significance of China, India, some other emerging or re-emerging powers in years to come. Hence the frenzy of attention to particularly China, on which Australia has produced so many distinguished sinologists, and all of a sudden, and rather recently, quite a lot of attention to modern India as opposed to the India of Nehru and so on. By the way, past Indian High Commissioner, Australian High Commissioner to India, who was assigned there twice in the 50s and I believe early 60s, wrote a book about largely Nehruvian India, which is much admired by Indian historians and quoted a great deal by Indian historians. He's probably completely forgotten in this country, but not happily in India. I saw him cited again by one of India's greatest historians the other day. Now, I mentioned that for China and particularly India, the colonial experience wasn't a happy one. And this often comes as a surprise to, say, Canadians and Americans, because all of us were brought up on the British version of the Raj, not the local version of the Raj. And while the Brits did leave behind a number of powerful inputs for independent India, Westminster parliamentary system, the railways, a number of other prized possessions of the Indian nation. The truth is, the Brits left India in catastrophic shape in 1947. The last 10 years of their administration, India suffered two major famines, one in the south, one in Bengal, that took millions of lives that the Brits somehow couldn't bestir themselves to either prevent or mitigate once they'd started, largely because they didn't seem to understand how society was organized in India without them. And it's very much to Nehru's credit that after India became independent, although hunger has always threatened many Indians and continues to, there was never again a great famine, as there had been so frequently under our British friends. So the Raj left a legacy of some resentment in India, although the Indian elite has tried to overcome it, mostly with success. In the pre-independence period, India had some experience of international relations, because you may know that the Brits arranged for India, rather as the Soviets arranged for Ukraine and Byelorussia, to have a so-called independent seat at the League of Nations, and there were Indians involved in tending to that, just as many of the people who wound up running the nuts and bolts of Chinese diplomacy early on had earlier experience with foreign policy in pre-communist China. When one reads what Nehru was thinking and writing in the 30s, and he was very prolific, he, Churchill, and de Gaulle were the great writers amongst statesmen of the 20th century. What he had in mind was Indian leadership of Asia. And at the time, of course, China remained in great distress and confusion. And it was probably difficult for Nehru to imagine what sort of a China would emerge, but he was aware that India would share space with China in Asia, and this was relevant to his major project, which was comity with Asia, and to a lesser degree with other countries struggling against colonial powers, hence the idea after independence of an Afro-Asian partnership that the Indians championed, one of Nehru's ideas. India as an independent country emerged at pretty well the same time as China as a communist country emerged. India in 1947 and China in 1949. And both new types of regime attempted to bring about a significant change. Because Nehru was such a cosmopolitan guy and knew pretty well everybody even before he was prime minister, he had the project of introducing around his new Chinese counterparts so that they could make friends also. He may have done this in a rather patronizing way, because a few years later, Zhou Enlai mentioned to a group of journalists that he had never met a more arrogant man. So the relationship got off to a very rocky start and has been, with a number of ups and downs, pretty tense ever since, because a relationship that Nehru had vaguely hoped would be a cooperative one became competitive very quickly, and it remains competitive, although the competition is by and large sensibly managed by both countries. I'll just mention a few milestones in the relationship that will strike memory bells with some of you. First, the Chinese invasion of Tibet in 1950. I was reminded of by an Indian scholar friend of mine, Prem Shankar Jha, the other day, that this was a repeat of something that had occurred early in the 20th century when the then Dalai Lama was expelled from Tibet by the Manchus and then also sought refuge in India and eventually came back to Tibet to rule it as leader of a more or less sovereign state once the Manchus had been expelled. And this may actually explain a degree of the Chinese anxiety about today's Dalai Lama being resident in India. The Dalai Lama stayed in China for many years after stayed in Tibet for many years after the Chinese invasion. The Indians acquiesced, by the way, in the Chinese invasion. This isn't well known, but in the early 50s, they obviously decided there was very little they could do about it. And so they grudgingly accepted the reality of Chinese sovereignty over Tibet. The Dalai Lama didn't flee to India until 1959, further to some additional upheavals in Tibet. And 1959 was the beginning of a sharp deterioration in relations between China and India that culminated in a border war some of you may remember hearing about in 1962. Nehru had quite a bit to do with provoking China, because a year before the war he adopted a so-called forward policy, which consisted of moving Indian military units up to and sometimes beyond the border. But the Chinese attack in 1962 came as a complete surprise to Nehru and the Indian government. They were completely unprepared to deal with it. The Chinese romped all over the territory they were interested in making a point about. Eventually, the Chinese unilaterally withdrew to the border as it had existed before the conflict. But the Indians never forgot, still don't forget today, that their one recent military encounter with China was a catastrophe for India. And while the Chinese have largely forgotten about the war, it's much easier to forget about a war you've won than one you've lost. It's very present in the minds of the whole geostrategic establishment in India, and it's present also in the ideology of a number of political parties in India, which are fairly revanchist. Following that unpleasant interlude for India, India decided it absolutely had to achieve nuclear parity with China. China exploded its first nuclear weapon in 1964. By 1974, India had tested. Lazily in the West, we think that was about Pakistan. It was actually all about China for the Indians. Pakistan was nowhere near as significant to them then as China was, and the same is true today. Pakistan is still not as significant to Indians as China is. When India tested again in 1998, the sitting government of India, the government led by Atal Bihari Vajpayee, formally explained its nuclear test by blaming it on China, so to speak, and China's armament efforts. One might have expected the Chinese to react rather sharply to these rude billets doux from Delhi, but actually, after one or two sharp words and working quietly with the Americans to clamp sanctions on India, the Chinese got over it fairly quickly, such that the following year, when their great ally in that part of the world, Pakistan, undertook a reckless adventure in Kargil, nearly everybody in this room will remember, in 1999, the Chinese decided to remain neutral, which was a surprise to Pakistan, and largely on Pakistani-Indian differences, the Chinese have been neutral ever since, urging the two parties to resolve their differences. Singular own goal for Pakistan. One of the many negative impacts on Pakistan of the Kargil campaign. Now, there was a moment that Indians were apprehending in the relationship with China that came to crescendo in 2008. you'll all remember that awoken by the growth of the Indian market, the United States started paying great attention to India as of about the mid-1990s, such that by the end of the 1990s, Strobe Talbot, Deputy Secretary of State, and the Indian Foreign Minister were hard at work trying to see if some sort of framework for a better relationship with the two countries could be agreed. The Clinton administration started too late, as they had on the Middle East also, so nothing happened. But both men wrote a good book about it. Both Strobe and Jaswant wrote interesting books, which I can commend to you. The Bush administration didn't pay much attention to India during its first term, but during its second term, India became its single remaining important project. It was trying to manage some projects it had unhappily launched during its first term, but the new project, and indeed the only positive legacy project, was this idea of revolutionizing the relationship between the United States and India. And the vector selected in order to do it was, improbably, nuclear cooperation, to negotiate with India to see whether an agreement on nuclear cooperation could bring India out of the pariah state that the Americans had consigned India to after the 1974 nuclear test, with some help from countries like Australia and Canada. The Americans and Indians negotiated very hard between 2005 and 2008. I think it's fair to say that most Indians felt the Indians didn't negotiate hard enough, while most international observers felt that the Indians had walked all over the Americans and came away with by far the best deal of the two. And it's important to remember the Bush administration was desperate for some foreign policy legacy items, so in that sense I'm sympathetic. However, the way the Americans very cleverly, because the Americans often are so clever in these ways, had structured their agreement with India in order for it to be operationalized, all of the nuclear countries not just with nuclear weapons, but nuclear capacities, were going to have to agree. First, the International Atomic Energy Agency board was going to have to agree. Secondly, the Nuclear Suppliers Group, a larger group of countries with nuclear capacities, was going to have to agree unanimously. So the Americans cleverly avoided a situation in which they could be accused of single-handedly giving away the shop to New Delhi. Secondly, were able to mobilize a great deal of international support, however unenthusiastic in some capitals, for the deal. The one capital that the Indians worried about rightly, and that Washington worried about rightly, Canberra, Ottawa, Helsinki, curiously, didn't keep them awake at night, was Beijing, because the Chinese could have wrecked the whole thing through proxies, if not directly. But actually, as it had at the time of Kargil, China stood aside and let it happen, presumably without enormous enthusiasm in Beijing, recognizing that India was growing up and that one way or the other, India's nuclear weapons and nuclear energy industry were a reality. So there are some milestones I thought I'd mention which help bring, I hope, the relationship into a bit of focus. There's a great deal more that could be said. A number of good authors go into it at exhausting length, but I'll spare you today. I thought now I'd allude to cross-cutting themes in the relationship that are important. Economic relations, pretty limited until quite recently. Today, China is India's top trading partner, and that happened rather suddenly without anybody really noticing. The two economies are, in very broad terms, complementary. because whereas the Chinese reforms focused on agriculture and industrialization, India's reforms produced, which came much later than China's, produced advances in the services field. Thus, there isn't, on the face of it, a great deal to compete over. The Indians complain that China has flooded India with, quote, shoddy goods, unquote, whereas the Indians have been less successful at flooding China with, quote, shoddy goods, unquote. And the Indians also have been less successful at penetrating the services field in China relative to what they've been able to do in the rest of the world. For India, the economic relationship is a source of anxiety, or comparing the two economies is a source of anxiety, because Deng Xiaoping had a 12-year start on the Indian reforms. The Indian reforms only came about because the Indian state went bankrupt in 1990. India probably would be unreformed today had that shock not come at New Delhi more or less out of the blue. So Indian reforms, which did lead rapidly to accelerating growth, followed the Chinese by many years. Secondly, India's growth has systematically been at least 2 percentage points lower than Chinese growth. So while Indian growth is spectacular when looked at in isolation, it's less spectacular when looked at next to Chinese growth. Both India and China did well during the recent economic and financial crisis. China seems to be, if the figures are to be believed, right back to where it was with growth in the 11% range. India's more like 7.5% at the moment, and may remain at that level for a while because there are some bottlenecks, notably infrastructure bottlenecks in India, but most of us would kill for 7.5% growth, obviously. But Indians constantly looking over their shoulders at China see China systematically outperforming India. And this gives rise to a great deal of anxiety and occasionally rage. Cross-investment is lacking between the two countries. India blocks a great deal of Chinese investment on spurious security grounds, or at least rather silly security grounds. Chinese are much more open to Indian investment, but the reality is there hasn't been much investment in either direction. And if the relationship is to mature, there will need to be a great deal more. So the two countries and the companies in the two countries might be thinking more about opportunities at that level. Secondly, the geostrategic level. As we know, China's been investing significantly, although not overwhelmingly, in its military. Most of this seems to be focused on its immediate neighborhood to the east, notably Taiwan. But many Indian geostrategic types are convinced that once China has dealt with Taiwan to its satisfaction, the Indian Ocean will become more of a project for China than it is today. Of course, holding these views within the geostrategic community in India is very good for business because you're trying to scare the government into spending more on the Indian military, which the successive Indian governments have notably failed to do, and that's still the case today. The bilateral strategic relationship, important to remember that Tibet overhangs India. If you look at a map of India, it's striking how enormous Tibet is, and that essentially it spans the whole northern border of India, interrupted by Nepal and Bhutan, the latter on good terms with India, the former increasingly trying to reposition itself as a friend of both. So Tibet is a source of concern for the Indians, and for the Chinese, India to the south of Tibet is a source of tremendous concern, given the religious, civilizational, and other links between India and Tibet historically. So Tibet makes each side very, very uneasy in a different way. India, about 20 years ago, came up with the so-called Look East policy and promptly forgot to do anything about it for about 10 years. It was premised on the idea that India had a great deal in common with these countries that Nehru was so keen on, so perhaps something should be done. There were two angles to it. One was economic. The other was China. How to prevent China from romping all over Southeast Asia and much of the rest of Asia without any competition at all. About 10 years ago, India started to give substance to its expression of interest in Asia, such that a number of dividends are beginning to roll in. Very significant economic relationships have been built up, notably with Singapore, but increasingly with Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand as well. And the civilizational links are being played up on both sides. So that's good news for India, that sustained work in Asia seems to be paying off. But once again, the Chinese are leagues ahead of the Indians because the Chinese didn't neglect for 10 years to follow through on their ideas. Great nervousness in India about Myanmar or Burma. Why? Because the Chinese have cleaned India's clock in Myanmar, and belatedly India is trying to reassert a historic relationship with Burma that it long had, including particularly under the Raj. But Chinese influence and also Thai business influence outclasses India's influence today. Multilaterally, China and India are very different actors. China says as little as possible. Great merit in saying as little as possible. Indians are never short of words and ideas to express, and thus have wound up irritating a whole lot of other actors multilaterally, while the Chinese quietly, very, very quietly, struck deals with the important players. As a permanent member of the Security Council in the last 12 or so years, China has been exceptionally accomplished, at times the dominant actor within the Security Council. India isn't in the Security Council, except very occasionally as an elected member. By the way, they're candidates for a seat in elections later this year. For us in the West, India's sometimes shrill and moralistic diplomacy is particularly irritating because they speak English better than we do, and we expect them to agree with us. And generally they don't agree with us and do so with great eloquence. So a lot of irritation between Western capitals and India, which frankly amounts to not a great deal of real importance.